Last week we started the story of Samson and saw that he really is no hero. He's a deeply flawed man with too much trust in his own strength, and he repeatedly betrayed the commitments that he owed to the Lord. Well, as we'll see today, this leads to the dreadful irony of his downfall, as he is betrayed and his might is lost. His is in no way a good example to follow, but the end of his story does teach a valuable lesson if we're willing to really learn from it. And it ties into what's found in 2 Corinthians 12:9, that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. So the best thing for us to do is to actually acknowledge our weakness, our blindness, and turn to Him as the only one who can give us light and make us strong. So for today, we're going to be in Judges chapter 16. Hopefully you're already there in your Bibles, but if not, you can go ahead and take a second to make it there. Maybe you pull out your phone and search on that. It's pretty much everybody has one of those. But if you want a paper Bible and didn't bring one with you, we do have some over on the counter as well that you can use. So Judges chapter 16, and we're going to start with verse 1. It says that Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And when the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, "In the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him." And Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. So just to be clear in the first place, this is not merely as though this were even a light thing, but it's not merely breaking the Nazirite vows here. God's law condemns prostitution for everyone. And then you tie that into the fact we talked last week that God also commands the Israelites not to marry foreign pagans. Well, committing prostitution with the foreign pagan is just another step. And then insult to injury on top of that, Samson went out of his way to do this. Gaza was the furthest south of the 5 Philistine cities when Samson was from the north of Israel. So this is him going as far from home as possible in order to do this. It shows how deliberate he is in doing whatever felt right to him. Now, as for the Philistines, they saw this as an opportunity to catch and kill Samson and be free of the enemy who's done them so much harm at this point. So they set an ambush to be able to take him at his most unawares, at the very break of day, when he's not going to be prepared. Or at least they think so. But he knows that they're on the lookout, and then amazingly, and I would actually venture to guess miraculously that this is something that God caused, they're the ones who fall asleep. Or at least we have to assume that, because he's able to go right up to the gates that they were supposed to be guarding, rip them off their hinges, and walk away. And pretty far away at that. Hebron, where he goes, was 40 miles from Gaza. That was how far he took these. Probably because he wanted to make a point. He was still holding a grudge against the people of Judah, fellow Israelites from a different tribe, but fellow Israelites who had tied him up and handed him over to the Philistines. And what we looked at last week, this is him reminding them of how strong he is too. And so this is all an odd, brief little note, these 3 verses, but it does set the stage importantly, because it shows Samson, for one thing, in just the complete assurance of his invincibility. And that seems justified to this point. God lets him do whatever he wants, and his enemies can't do anything about it. Or at least that's what he thinks. But the Philistines, in spite of all the evidence to this point, they're not done yet. This just teaches them that they need a new approach. They can't beat him head on. But they think they've figured out a potential weakness, and that's what they're going to try to use to figure out how to take his strength away. That's what begins at verse 4. It says, "Afterward it happened that he loved the woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, 'Entice him, and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver.' So Delilah said to Samson, 'Please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you.' And Samson said to her, 'If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man.' So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them, And now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire, so the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Look, you've mocked me and told me lies. Now please, tell me what you may be bound with." So he said to her, "If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. And Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom." So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. So just so we're clear on this for later on, in case it's not obvious, Samson's real weakness is women, his pursuit of them, and his inability to say no to them. That's what becomes his undoing, and he's picked a real gem here. We're not told much about Delilah. There's a lot of her history that we're not informed of. Even whether or not she's actually a Philistine is never explicitly said, though that does, of course, seem very likely. Another thing that is maybe a statement in silence is the fact that nothing is said about her living either with a father or with a husband of any type. Because for a woman at that time period to have her own house and not be living with a man may be suggestive of the fact that she was a prostitute too. Now, whether or not that's the case, what we do know is that money was what motivated her more than anything else. And the Philistine lords make an incredible offer to her. They didn't have to threaten, like what happened with Samson's first wife. Instead, they promised to pay her 5,500 shekels of silver. Because, again, there's 5 Philistine cities, a lord to each one. Each one of those lords promised her 1,100 shekels. And so, for context, that would have amounted to about 140 pounds of silver, which, even today, it's a pretty penny. That would be about, by bullion weight, $60,000. But that's not the right point of comparison. A better one is the fact that at that time period, the average laborer made about 10 shekels every year. And so if you compare that to today and say that a laborer makes maybe about $40,000, that means they offered her $20 million to do this. That's the comparable value here. They were willing to pay a fortune for Samson's secret. And she was willing to take it because he foolishly loved her, but she didn't love him. And Samson just continues to be the fool, the tool that we have discovered him to be. Strength of arms, but no strength of character. Because rather than recognizing his danger and leaving her, he plays this stupid game. And that is almost certainly how Delilah played it off. She would have tied him up each time with his consent in order to play along and test his strength. And then she would have been coyly calling to him. It's not like she brought the Philistines out and was threatening him. Again, it's a game. And then she reacted with pretended pleasure at his strength and pretended disappointment with his withholding the truth. The other Philistines would have just been waiting all of this out to see the results as they're constantly probing for weakness. And he is giving the game away by providing answers that seem plausible enough. Now, maybe not to us. This doesn't make a lot of sense. We know the escapes he's capable of. And so why would any of these things hold him? That's because it's really about magic. The Philistines believed that Samson was under some type of spell that made him as strong as he was, and so they're looking to break that charm by using some type of counterspell. And the ancients believed magic worked that way, that you would have some type of mundane element, but if you used it the right way, then you could have a positive or a negative magical effect that way. That's what they are after, and that's not going to work because the power comes directly from God. But Samson is still playing with fire here because he's drawing attention to things that he shouldn't be. Not so much with the second one, the new ropes. That one really does feel like he's just poking fun at Delilah because we already know that cannot hold him. That was what they tried to tie him up with last week. But The other two things that he presents to her as possibilities, they're too close to the mark. Because fresh bowstrings, those are animal tendons. That was what they used to make them from. And so for them to not be dried, what's that saying is that they're still fresh parts of a corpse. He is inviting another violation of his Nazirite status with that. And then the thing with the loom, well, that's bringing attention to his hair and shows that he's thinking of it, that his resolve is weakening under his pouting. He's getting careless, after which the game's over, at what we find starting at verse 15. She said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies." And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he's told me everything." So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees, and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. Delilah finally broke Samson down, and he told her the full truth, showing us actually as readers for the first time that he actually knew it. I haven't really made this much of a question at any point here, but technically, his parents were the only ones that we are made aware of actually knew about him being a Nazirite. They were the ones who were told. It was possible that they never told him. And so you could have held out hope in reading his story that all of his breaches were in ignorance rather than arrogance. Well, here now it's clear. He has known all along. He's done all of these things anyway, and he was holding on to just one vestige of his relationship with God. Not that they even had a relationship, just this connection that they had. And probably because he viewed it the same way that the Philistines did, ultimately. That it was a spell. That his hair was magical. It was the one superstition that he kept, as we so often do. Thinking that some particular pious expression, like an offering at church, or one of those stupid Facebook memes with a picture of Jesus that says, "My child will not scroll past without liking and commenting," those things will keep them in good standing with God. And then they can just go on and do whatever else they want instead, because it's magical. But that's not how it works. This is just God saying, "You've given away every part of what I offered you, so I'm done." And with this final betrayal, the Lord's gone too. It's a truly pitiful sight, as Samson wakes up and just assumes he can do what he's always done, not knowing at first that the Lord has left him for treating all of his blessings so flippantly. But he soon sees his error, briefly. When his strength is gone, he's overpowered for the first time in his life and blinded. And that really is the irony of all of this. Samson's trouble was always doing what was right in his own eyes. Now it's ended in his eyes being taken from him. The man who once moved so freely from north to south in his enemy's territory becomes their slave. And he grinds their wheat when at one time he had burned fields of it. He's become nothing. It's a sickening moment. But it does end with just the least note of hope, because hair grows back. Restoration is possible, and the Lord's not done with Samson yet. We find the end of his story starting at verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, Our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. And so it happened, when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may perform for us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them. And they stationed him between the pillars. And then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them. Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and on all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. From the Philistine perspective, it was not just Samson who was defeated when they captured him. That's why they celebrate with thanksgiving in the temple, because they saw this as Dagon's victory over Yahweh, their national God over Israel's national God. But they put themselves on very shaky ground with that, because Yahweh is not just Israel's God, he is God, full stop. Now, as for Samson, he's blind, but he also sees better than he ever has before. Not to say that he sees the truth very well. It's kind of like going from being completely blind to having blurry vision, because his focus is not on helping the Israelites, whose oppression he should now really understand, and his focus is not on the Lord, who's been most offended throughout all of this. It's on what he has lost. He wants revenge over being blinded, but what he acknowledges at last is that his strength was not his own, and that he has to ask the Lord for it. And that is not nothing. It is better than everything that he has done before, and it lets him do more than he has done before. Still, even this is not really a triumph. It took his last gasp. And Samson has ultimately done very little. In his life, he defeated somewhere slightly over 1,000 Philistines. In his death, he kills 3 times that. So for one thing, that means he was more used to God dead than alive. Not a great statement for him. And then on top of that, his defeated enemies numbered far fewer than any of the other primary judges that we've looked at. Their victories, yes, they weren't one-on-one. Samson, he did this single-handed. But all those other judges, Othniel and Ehud and Deborah and Gideon and Jephthah, they're defeated their enemies in the tens of thousands. He hasn't done a lot. And also, the other thing that is different from him than the rest of them is that Israel doesn't have peace at the end of his time as judge, which means that God's word has held true. Because back before he was born, back in chapter 13 and verse 5, he had mentioned that through Samson, he would just begin to deliver the Israelites. He wasn't going to get to finish yet. But it did begin. And if nothing else, at the very end, Samson has made himself a useful tool in the Lord's hands. Now, this story is not entirely, and frankly, it's not remotely uplifting. Not everything in the Bible is. But this is for learning from. Samson, with his foolishness and arrogance, is a miniature for Israel, for the nation, in their idolatry and their unfaithfulness to the Lord. Well, Israel is a miniature for humanity, for everyone, because this is what we do. God grants us these great blessings, and at some level, we know that they come from Him, but we treat them like they come from us. that we are strong enough in ourselves to play with fire and not be burned, or to go along with this story, to run with scissors and not cut ourselves. That we can pursue whatever we want. There won't be consequences. The lust of the eyes, like Delilah was for Samson. The lust of the flesh, like the payday was for Delilah. The pride of life, like Dagon was for the Philistines and his victory. And to think that nothing is going to happen to us, at least as long as we throw God the scraps. And just offering him, again, those little things that we hold on to as though that's the actual meaning of religion. Empty rituals that we've shorn of meaning by not actually pursuing the Lord until we wind up blind, lost in the dark. But even then, there is hope, because hair grows back. Or as Jesus puts it in Matthew chapter 11, verse 5, the blind see and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up and the poor have the gospel preached to them. God can restore, and that is what he offers through Jesus Christ, the one who's faithful and true. In his death, Samson accomplished more for God than he had in his life, and he gave his life to make that happen. For him, that was a sad statement of how far he had fallen. For Jesus, yes, he was born to die, and deliverance began with him, but it also ended with him, because he was not merely buried in his father's Joseph's tomb. He ascended to his heavenly Father's throne. And he gave his life not to take life, but to save it forever to everyone who relies on his strength. And so he's the one that we look to. Life will confront us with our weakness. We're not going to be able to avoid that. But that's what God then uses to show where real power resides. We can't do it. We can't defeat what we are up against. We don't have to. And when we embrace that truth and turn ourselves over to him, that's when he shows his might and makes us strong for the fights that we are up against. As our hero, who cannot be defeated, enables us to overcome the world. So we can be far stronger than Samson if we know that when we're weak, God's strong. And now, if anyone here or somebody watching, if you're not a Christian, the question I would have for you is whether you feel sometimes the weight of the world on your shoulders, so to speak. And after hearing this and seeing that even Samson wasn't strong enough, are you realizing now that you have been blind to your own danger? If you do see that, I hope you won't continue to trust in yourself, because you can only lose that way. Instead, look to the one who's mighty to save. Jesus gave his life in your place so that you can live in light forever. So don't waste the potential that he purchased for you the way that Samson did. Believe in Jesus. And when I say that, I don't mean believe that he existed. I mean believe in him. Trust in him. Trust that he can save you. Because if you do, you will be delivered from death. And Christians, we know what that means. That our bodies may sleep in our tombs, but they'll rise. And even at the moment that our bodies die, our souls go to be safe in the Lord's hands. So live like it. Remember what you were without him. Acknowledge how weak you are in comparison to him, so that he can be glorified by the strength that he shows through you. Lean on him, knowing that the cross cannot be knocked down. And share that truth with those who are still praising the wrong thing, so that they can find his support before everything that they're relying on comes crashing down around them.